We are now recording, so can we have a thumbs up that everybody's happy to be recorded? JQ, Con,
Thank you very much
Eve,
indeed.
thank you very much, Steve, for that. I will monitor the lobby and now pass to Henry. And obviously, in usual playpen fashion, if you have a question, please raise a hand. But Henry, over to you, and let's get cracking, as they say.
Right, thanks very much, Steve. Morning, Sarah. Morning, everyone. It's good to have the pension regulator among us. I've widely circulated a list of questions which I'm going to ask, and if anyone wants to ask their questions, there are 3 ways of doing it. There's chat, there's putting your hand up, or there's being blatantly rude and interrupting. I do hope we won't have any blatantly rude interruptions. We haven't had any for ages, not since our famous photo bomb incident back over a year ago now. So without more ado, let's get on with it. And my first question is really what do you see going into 2024 as the biggest challenge for the pension regulator, Sarah?
Well, thanks, Henry, and thanks very much for having me at the playpen. I can see some familiar faces on the screen, so delighted to be here. Shame we can't be meeting in person, which I think is what people are getting the hang of these days again, and certainly I'm enjoying it. Anyway, 2024. For us, a huge focus this year, Henry, is going to be on raising the standards of trusteeship. It feels like perhaps it needs a snappy title like the Year of the Trustee or something like that, but maybe we'll leave that for a bygone era.
We've got the Year of the Dragon. Maybe the same thing.
Some will know I started my life in pensions as a member nominated trustee, and I'm a massive fan of the trustee system that we have in the UK. I was just extolling its virtues to some non-pensions people at an event I was at on Saturday night, which just shows you what an exciting person I am. I mean, trustees have a fiduciary duty to work for the best interests of pension savers, which I think is a massively valuable backbone of the system that we have. We shouldn't underestimate how powerful that is. But it is an increasingly difficult and challenging job. And we have really diligent trustees, but we need really capable trustees as well. We are quite unapologetic about the standards we expect from trustees, and it's not necessarily enough to be hardworking and diligent and well-meaning. These days, there are many areas that trustees really need to have a good grip on in terms of investment, data and digital capabilities, oversight of administrators, oversight in relation to scams and financial crime. And so being responsive, being data-driven, being outcome-focused, these are all watchwords that we expect every trustee to be focusing on this year and going forward. We'll be working this year to introduce a register, trustee register, which is going to help us to get a really firm grip on the trustee landscape out there and raise standards across the board. And we're also really conscious of how the trustee market is changing. It's changing really rapidly, much of that for the good. We need to be on top of the risks that presents and understand how those can be managed for savers, but also the opportunities that it presents for making sure that the industry develops in the way that really delivers best outcomes for savers. So trusteeship, raising the quality of trusteeship will be our watchword for 2024.
Thanks very much. I guess with that comes the stick that if you don't see good quality trusteeship, you've got sanctions and greater powers. Do you feel that you need more power? Do you feel that you have got sufficient power to deal with poor trusteeship now?
Well, where we see really poor trusteeship, we take prosecution action against that, and I hope that you have, I'm sure you've been following the actions that we take for those trustees that really abuse that position for the benefit of themselves rather than the benefit of savers. For those trustees who are doing a diligent job but perhaps feel slightly overwhelmed by the requirements of them. Sometimes I hear the cry, well, you know, I'm a trustee of a really small scheme, Sarah. Can't you just reduce the requirements for us a little bit compared to the trustees of big schemes? To which I say, why should the savers in small schemes not expect the same standard of care as savers in larger schemes? So I think the sort of area where there are diligent trustees who feel that life is getting a little bit more complicated and difficult, maybe they should consider whether this path really is the right one for them, or there are other options open for them as to where their savers may be better looked after.
I think this takes me on to that sort of second question, which is about mindset, really. TPR have developed a sort of very strong approach towards funding over the years, and really quite I would go so far as to say a stern view really on funding, but there seems to be a new mindset afoot. You know, famously Bin Afalami talking about not wanting the pension regulator to be regulating the quietest graveyard. Have you thoughts on this, and can you sort of tell us whether you think a new mindset is required and is actually happening at the pension regulator?
So I think there's a new mindset in the industry and in the pensions industry, which is developing and which I think is required. The world is changing, and we as an industry need to change with it, and we as a regulator need to change with it. You know, in the past we had employers offering defined benefit schemes which provided a promise of an income to their savers, and savers could relax and not necessarily have any risk on that. Now, let's remember, in those days, there were many, many millions of people who had absolutely no provision, and there were also people who had potentially been contributing to schemes all of their lives. And if an employer suffered a rather catastrophic event shortly before they retired, they might have got absolutely nothing from a pension scheme that they've been delivering for their whole lives, now contributing to for their whole lives. Now we're in a better situation now in that respect, and that we've got millions and millions more people into the pension system through auto enrolment. We have the situation where if savers are in a DB scheme and something happens to their employer, then they've got the safety net of the PPF. But on the flip side, we have a pension saving environment where the risk has transferred onto the individual, both in terms of how their investments perform and how long they might live. And that requires a very different mindset from the industry in terms of how we measure whether what individual savers are getting is meeting their expectations, meeting the outcomes that we're trying to achieve for them, and whether we need to do anything to reset to get there, or in fact whether we need to change how the product is delivered to make sure that it can better deliver. So I think the mindset of the industry is already changing. We're trying to move that along in terms of value for money, making sure the focus is on outcomes, not just on costs. We'll talk about some of these things, I'm sure, in terms of consolidation, efficiencies of products, and in terms of decumulation and the whole of life, and making sure that we're looking at all the stages that savers need to worry about, not just the accumulation stage. For us, so I think that mindset change is happening for us as a regulator. Obviously, we are focusing now our efforts on protecting the system that we have at the moment, enhancing that system, doing what we can to work with the industry to enhance what we've got, and also to innovate, in particular in areas like retirement, to make sure that we encourage innovation in the interests of savers.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll stop there. No, I'll stop there. I could go on forever, you know me. You better just shut me up when you need to.
Well, I do want to hear you going on forever. Unfortunately, we've only got an hour. I've got a lot of questions. I'm sure there's a lot of ones out there. One of the questions that's come in is, you know, is the new governance code, which arrived last week, is that part of the reset, or is it just a continuity of what we've had before? Is it a sort of consolidation, or is it new?
Honestly, for everyone in this audience, I think it's largely a consolidation of what we've had before. There should be not a massive amount in the general code that is new to people. Certainly, we've been talking about it for a long time, and even before some of these things were codified, things like the own risk assessment, effective system of governance. You know, I know that most schemes will have been doing their own risk assessment processes for many, many years, will have a whole suite of policies that set out how the scheme is governed. And this is just putting a name around things that schemes have been doing for many years. Hopefully, putting everything together in one code makes it much easier for trustees to and their advisors to understand what is expected of them and to make sure that they are meeting those expectations, but in a way that is flexible for them. And we've been very clear, despite requests, oh, please, can you give us a template for an own risk assessment, etc. We've been very clear, you know, it's your risk assessment, it's particular to your scheme, it's up to you to say what's right for you. What's important, though, is we know there are groups of trustees, we know maybe 1 in 5 don't read our codes at all. So whether they will find it easier to read the general code rather than different codes, we don't know. But you know, this now makes it very clear all in one place what our expectations are of them, makes it easier for us to say when trustees aren't meeting those expectations, there aren't any excuses for not knowing what our expectations are, and enables us to consider what action we need to take if our expectations are not being met.
A quick straw poll. How many of the people on this call have actually read the new general code? Put your hand up. Yes, super virtuous. Well done. You know, I'm seeing hands going up. There you are, Sarah. We are a compliant lot. Okay, moving on. There's a more contentious code to come. We've got the DB funding code. And I saw an interesting letter which the Pensions Minister had written to the Work and Pensions Committee, which looked like a shot across the bow, saying, you know, we're expecting to see some changes really from the DB funding code drafts of yore. Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment of the situation?
Well, we're hoping that the regulations will be coming soon. So they're still, how long have we been saying that for? Yeah. Still in development from the DWP. So let's just be clear, because I think we talk about everything as the DB code, but the DWP issues the DB funding regulations, and then we deliver our code off the back of that. We anticipate, and we're still working towards the regulations being enforced by April. Our code following on after that, shortly after that, which will enable us to have schemes working with valuation dates from September of this year, working with that code. And obviously, as we know, 15 months after that date is when the valuation is due. So those are the timetables we're working to. Still discussions in place as to exactly what the final draft of the regulation will be. We've had lots and lots of useful feedback, and we're trying to make sure that the code, what we anticipate to have in the code and what will be in the regulations, will work very well together to ensure that there are as few confusions as possible for schemes, that it's very clear, and that there is flexibility for schemes to apply it to their own individual circumstances.
Well, a question which has been asked several times of various people from the pension regulator and being asked again is, will we see the impact assessment as well?
So the impact assessment is of the regulations is in the gift of the DWP. So I am sure they will consider that question at the appropriate time.
Okay, we won't put DWP on the spot, although I think there is a DWP official on the call. But we would like to sort of say, and I think it's not just Con who's put it in the chat, but Derek has mentioned it in the past, that we really do need to see what the impact assessment is from the government's point of view.
I mean, I've said before, Henry, and I will say again, you know, my belief is that for most schemes, the DB code will not introduce things that require them to do massively different things than they are doing already. We've got a lot of data that suggests many schemes are already running their valuations and their funding discussions in accordance with the sort of drafts of the code. Certainly when I was working with trustees before taking on this role sort of early in 2020, that was the case. And so, you know, I don't believe the essence of the code, the regulations and the essence of the code is where trustees are taking risk within the scheme to explain why, how that risk is being taken and how that is being supported. And I think most schemes, certainly in this call, are already doing that well and saying what their objective is. So I don't believe the code introduces a massive sea change that people have to get their heads around.
Yeah, well, we were very pleased to see the Minister recognising the importance of schemes who are wanting to stay open, being supported in the code, and hopefully we'll see that reflected in both in what DWP come as final regs and what you're producing.
And remember that open schemes, you know, the title of open schemes can cover a massive multitude, a massive spectrum of situations. You know, a scheme with 100,000 deferred members and 1 active member can be classified as an open scheme, which is very different from a scheme with 100,000 active members and 50,000 deferred members, for example. So those 2 types of schemes might both be classed as open, but would need different considerations around funding.
Yeah, we'd like to see more schemes open for future accrual, wouldn't we, if possible? Is that a generally held feeling now that if schemes are open to future accrual, that's a good thing? Or are we in the sort of the old mindset we said we would really like to see as first and foremost there being self-sufficiency and targeted buyout? Do you get the gist of what I'm trying to say?
I'm not sure I totally get the gist of it, but I think whether a scheme, you know, what benefits an employer is offering through their pension scheme is a question for the employer rather than one for regulation to determine.
I'm just talking about encouragement and the general mood, the mood music, which says let's have future accrual if we possibly can do, rather than
there should be nothing in the regulations that prevents an employer from offering an open DB pension scheme where it is appropriate and desirable for that employer if they can support it.
Okay. Good. Sorry, I'm trying not to put words in your mouth, but I fear I may have sort of rather railroaded you into saying something there. So do shut me up if I push you. CDC. Had a number of questions from various people about CDC. I think we all want it, but we're really rather worried that we may not get it. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm personally a big fan. I think CDC means different things to different people. There's also obviously many different guises. I was the chair of a CDC scheme that was set up maybe 70 years ago. Maggie, I see on the call, was a trustee of that scheme with me. It became a DB scheme after the KPMG case.
This is the Pensions Trust, yeah?
So the growth plan within the Pensions Trust, yeah. Okay. So I mean, the changing nature of the scheme demonstrates the difficulties in this area. I also, you'll know, chaired the CDC stream of Steve Webb's Defined Ambition piece of work when he was Pensions Minister back in 2012. So I have a long history in this area. And, you know, the principle for me is when you have millions of people saving in what is essentially a single savings vehicle, which we do in Master Trust, there has to logically be some possibility for sharing of risk around investments, around longevity, etc. So in principle, there has, you know, it suggests there are opportunities there. But there are differences between whole of life CDC, at retirement CDC, etc. And I know different people have different views on what is possible and what isn't. At TPR, we've been clear that solving the problem at retirement, so turning your pension pot into income, is a really, you know, one of the next big challenges for us as an industry. And CDC, I think, could eventually really be a big part of that consideration. So we welcome the development of CDC. We welcome all of the efforts that are going on to innovate in this area, and we're working hard with DWP on that. As you know, most of it's been on single employers so far. There's lots of interest in what's possible for multi-employers, although that is a considerably more difficult question as to how to develop that. We need to make sure any models that do progress not only deliver for savers in terms of the opportunities, but also have the right protections in place, the right understanding about what's a promise, what's not a promise, etc. So lots of interesting questions to continue to consider as CDC gets developed, but we do expect a consultation on the regulations looking at multi-employers from DWP later this year. So we're working hard on that.
Do you think that the CDC code as it stands has set the bar rather too high, and that we've, as a result of that, failed really to capitalise on the excellent work of the Royal Mail?
Bar too high in what respect?
Well, we don't seem to have anybody jumping it other than Royal Mail.
Well, I think that a single employer CDC requires a number of different things to be in place, and that's employer appetite, a large scale of the workforce, a large workforce that wants to take part in this. So there's a number of different elements that would need to work for an employer. So I don't know, we've got to balance the attractiveness to the employer as well as protection for savers. So.
Okay. VFM, huge push in the summer. Since then, I guess a bit of a roaring silence, and perhaps a fear that the momentum that was building up behind that may be lost as we go into an election, or as we are in an election year. Do you see the pension regulator and the FCA's feet to the metal on VFM, or is there going to be a necessary lull?
So as we know at TPR, FCA and DWP, that we really want this framework to apply across the trust-based and contract-based pensions world, and I think it's really important for that to be the case. We remain committed to that objective of developing a holistic framework, and I think DWP and FCA do as well. You will know, though, that the rule-making powers differ for us and FCA, and FCA have different timetables that they can work to than DWP, and we do because of legislative time in Parliament. So we remain supportive of the FCA consulting on their detailed rules this spring, and we really hope that all trust-based schemes will engage with that as well and submit their comments and views into that consultation too, because if we get those views into this consultation rather than just in a separate one, then we can continue to make sure that framework develops lockstep. We've had loads of interaction with the industry on this in a whole sort of different areas, so we're really grateful for that. We're taking that into account. I mean, I think the momentum, we are trying to keep that momentum up as much as we can, but things do happen in terms of the political world, which sometimes mean there are delays for legislation. So, but the people that I speak to in the industry are really telling me that this is something that they would value and continue to value. So the momentum's not falling on it. I think stakeholders, I was talking to some senior stakeholders recently, and they told me that they feel they have moved on from looking at costs when it comes to selecting schemes. Costs is a sort of bar that schemes providers that are pitching need to get over or under, if you like, and then they're looking at things like member engagement, technology, investment strategies, etc. But what they're not necessarily paying as much attention to yet is how they measure whether what has been delivered compares with what was the objective and how that's and what else has been delivered in the market. And they've told me that a framework to help them assess that would be really helpful for them. So we absolutely continue to see this as a top priority, and the foot is very much to the pedal.
Good, and there's a statement from DWP, from Lacey. Thank you very much for that, Lacey. Much to the same effect. No relenting in the forward progress of VFM then. Interesting new phrase creeping into the vocabulary of the pension regulator, the full service DC pension scheme. I looked at this with interest and thought, what do they mean? I mean, would you like to elaborate, Sarah, about what you mean by full service pensions for DC plans?
Well, I mean, I think it's reasonably straightforward, which is something that takes you from when you start saving to when you perhaps stop drawing your pension, which maybe when you depart the mortal coil. You know, a pension doesn't stop when you stop working. It arguably starts when you stop working. And in fact, as I get older and talk to more people in my peer group who have stopped working, actually a lot of people now don't want to stop working, hang up their tools at state pension age and sit around doing the crossword and Sudoku. I do that now, so maybe I'm already almost there.
On the glide path, the Sudoku
exactly.
glide path. Yeah.
I mean, there is the transition between accumulation and decumulation is not necessarily a single point. There is going to be increasingly a mixture of accumulation, spending wealth, decumulation at the same time. And savers at those different points in time are faced with very complex choices at each stage, and we don't want them to be on their own at each of those stages and thinking, what on earth am I going to do now? We've taken the step to auto enroll people into pension saving. I think it's really important that there's an easy pathway for savers at each important stage through that journey, and so we think it's important for providers to really look at how they can help savers along every part of that journey and consider whether that is something that they can do or whether they might need to merge with other providers to enable them to do that. We need the sector really to be focused, as I say, on outcomes for savers, what the objectives are for those, and deliver the capacity and choice that really serves the mass market that we've got through auto enrollment.
Okay, I think a lot of people still think they're going to get a pension from their workplace savings, and let's hope that they don't get disappointed when they arrive at retirement. I think it is a space for innovation, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. So that when I said, that sort of three focus points are protecting, enhancing, and innovating, particularly innovating in this retirement space. And so that full service DC pension is, let's think about how we're taking people across all stages of that journey. It's not like I'm here, as a provider, we don't really think it's, I mean, there may be some providers, but just to say, I'm here from when you're 20 to when you're 67, and that's it. After that, kind of you're on your own. There must be some way of helping those savers when they get to the end of that particular pathway to point them towards what the next stage of their journey is.
Okay, so the emphasis very much on signposting as opposed to providing, but innovation is needed. Yeah. Okay, that's
good. And
a
competitive marketplace that is saver driven.
I agree with all that. Okay, let's move on. Just a word about super funds. It's clearly something that the government sees as really important. They talk about it a lot. We've seen one super fund authorised, and we've seen one
assessed. Henry.
Assessed. Sorry. Excuse me. Assessed, and one deal done. Yeah. How do you see the market progressing
for super funds?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully with lots of innovation.
Yes.
I mean, we recognise the difficulty of an uncertain regulatory environment. So we are working closely with the DWP and Treasury and the FCA on the permanent super fund regime. We think that's really important, provide some certainty to those that are looking to provide investment and innovation in that area. And we are seeking to engage actively with all those who are innovating in this area and in other areas, in terms of whether it be super funds or capital back journey plans or other things. You know, the concept of capital supporting pension schemes is not a new one. You know, it is essentially what employers do. They use shareholder capital to support a pension scheme. It is essentially what insurers do when schemes move to an insured buyout. Insurance shareholder capital is used to support a pension scheme. Using a different form of capital, whether that be in a super fund or a different form of capital back journey plan to support a pension scheme, is not a new concept. But it's important to make sure that the safeguards are there to ensure that savers' interests are protected from the other interests around profit, etc. So, you know, we've got those safeguards in employers supporting DB schemes. We've got those safeguards in insurers taking on DB schemes through buyout. And now we're developing those safeguards for other forms of capital being used to support DB schemes.
Thank you for that. My final question is really about consolidation, and very broad one. You know, how do you feel consolidation's going? Is it going as you would hope, or would you feel that we need to speed up that process? Are the right schemes consolidating? All those kind of questions. How do you feel about the market generally?
So the data tells us that the market is consolidating. Certainly with single employer DC schemes, we've seen consolidation there. We see consolidation in the master trust market, and we see interesting developments in the DB market. Obviously, lots of schemes are in a funding position that means they can consider different routes, and we're also seeing interesting developments in terms of the kind of consolidation of scheme governance for multiple schemes in there. So it is going well. We think there's more that can be done. We know that not necessarily, you know, there continue to be lots of DC schemes that have very little awareness of the regulations that apply to them. So we're continuing to look at different approaches from us for those. For master trusts, we've heard the feedback that our regimes are very helpful for master trust that is kind of in a, you know, potentially a failing merger situation, but the guidance is not so helpful where there's a friendly merger. So we're looking at how our processes can support that more effectively. For DB schemes, we know that sort of consolidation is not necessarily high on the agenda if the DB scheme is kind of doing well and not necessarily a problem for the employer. And we know that there are potentially some things to think around advisors and conflicts with business models, etc., in consolidation, whether that be in buyout or other forms of consolidation, which are interesting to consider. And even for trustees, you know, it can be a challenging consideration when you think you're doing a good job to think, well, why would someone else be doing a better job than me? I'm doing a good job. But I've spoken to really capable trustees of schemes sort of sub 10 million, which are completely closed to future accrual. And we know that we don't have enough great trustees across the whole landscape of schemes. And I think, you know, we could be getting more from the skills if we could apply your skills to perhaps more schemes or a wider collection of schemes, a bigger scheme than the small scheme that you're applying your skills to. So I think there is further to go in the consolidation area to deliver really good outcomes for savers. But we're going to make sure we're focused on doing that in the right way, not just consolidation for consolidation's sake. So,
I mean, the message is we are consolidating. There's more work to do, but we're comfortable with the pace of consolidation at the moment. Would that be a summation of what you said?
Sorry, Henry, if you say that again, I got distracted by a question on the chat.
We are consolidating. We're happy with the pace of consolidation, but there's much more work still to do, would be a summation of what you'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there is a huge question that's just come in from Porrig. I think the best thing to do is to ask Porrig to ask that question, but there have been other questions too, which I've had. I know Con wants to ask some. We've got about 25 minutes left, so I'll kick off with Porrig and then I'll come to Con if I may. Is that okay,
Thank you,
Porrig?
Henry. Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Henry.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, Sarah, you recognise uncertainty of the regulatory environment, but you've got no power over that uncertainty when it comes to the half-baked approach that the government of the time used with something like pension freedoms. That can take the rug out from everyone, including the market that's got to invest millions of pounds into creating a structure that would satisfy a free market that is consumer focused. You also speak of innovation, but people have been speaking about that in all the time I've been writing about this area, which is more than 25 years, right? So when are we going to see straw men thrown up by organisations that are overseeing the market like TPR and FCA that can be used as discussion that would also indicate the direction of the kind of working out that the regulators have, whether the direction they'd like to see the structure move towards, so that you give more confidence to those very people that have got to invest not only shareholder money, but also the pension, you know, the money that's underpinning the pensions that of the people that you want to support. I mean, it's all very well plain innovation, but frankly, if I had £1 for every time someone said that to me in the last quarter century, I wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere in the Caribbean. Okay.
And looking out the window and daylight today, that would be a nice place to be. So let me deal with your first, which is around the uncertainty in the regulatory environment and no power over government. I mean, we do engage really actively with DWP and increasingly with Treasury on policy developments. I think when I talked about the new mindset and the shift, you know, I think there's a new mindset in government as well. We are seeing increasingly large pots of money being run, managed collectively by trustees, which can be systemically important for the economy of the UK, depending on how they are invested or how they are managed. So this area is important to, it's always been important to DWP. It's increasingly important to Treasury because of how the industry is developing. We're very cognizant of that. We engage actively with them. We do have no power over government, but we do have a lot of information and expertise that we can use to provide input when things are being considered. And let me reassure you that we use that to the extent that we can to work in the best interests of savers. On innovation, we recognise the importance of innovation for the future development of products for savers and a good savings regime. We recognise there's work we need to do to develop our processes to enable innovation, the first steps of innovation to happen in a safe space. That's really difficult when you're dealing with someone's life savings. So we need to collectively think about what we need to do as a regulator with you to provide the sort of safe space where we can test out new products, new thinking in a way that doesn't require millions and millions and millions of pounds before you get to the answer, computer says no. So it's something I think we need to work on together. I recognise that we've been talking about it for a long, long time. And you know, I've been in conversations nearly 15 years ago about new things like CDC, which we're still talking about. So I recognise your frustrations, but I think let's keep trying.
On that happy note, let's move on to Con. Con, do you want to unmute yourself, old chap?
I hope that's succeeded in unmuting.
It has.
Sarah, the question I want to ask is really a very basic one. The primary risk measure, the primary measure of performance that's used by TPR and indeed by the PPF is the funding ratio. So the question is, what work have you, or the TPR if you know of it, done to actually measure the relevance of the funding ratio to the ability to pay pensions.
So thank you for the question, Con.
Should I
As
explain a little bit more? Would that help?
Why not?
Okay.
I'll let Henry decide when you should stop explaining.
Yeah, I will moderate here.
It's really very simple. And it's well illustrated by the case of USS. If you model the performance of a fund like USS or any other come to that, then what you'll find is that in relatively short horizons, 3 years or so, you have very high breaches of the funding ratio, very high downside performances, but the overwhelming majority of those, in fact, recover without any intervention. So interventions and things like deficit repair contributions, in the case of USS, modeling that, 85% of the time, no intervention was appropriate.
Are you intervening too much, Sarah's question?
So what I would say at a high level as an answer to this is that we have a very wide variety of schemes in the UK. Not all schemes are like USS. The vast majority are small schemes and smaller schemes, certainly than that. In fact, all of them are smaller schemes than that, and not necessarily multi-employer. That is why in the UK we have a scheme-specific funding regime, not a prudential regime as they have in other jurisdictions like the Netherlands. And the point of that is that schemes like the USS can take a different approach to funding than a very much smaller scheme with only a single employer, which might be in different financial circumstances. And the point of the funding code and the point of our approach to funding is that if it is appropriate for schemes to be able to take more risk, whether that be investment risk or other sorts of risk because of their situation, then as long as they can explain to us how they are doing that and how they may recover that in different circumstances, then that is perfectly acceptable for schemes to take that scheme-specific funding approach. The reality is that employers do go bust. And a large part of the funding regime is to make sure that in a crystallization event like that, which may be further off for a large multi-employer scheme than for other sorts of schemes, then the members of that scheme are in a position that they are not, well, in a position that they weren't pre-TPR regime in 2004 when they stood naked in the sea in Brighton and lost all of their pension money. Employers do go bust. We have to have an eye to that, and that was what the funding regime is about. It's to make sure that in difficult circumstances, savers are protected and that there is not an unreasonable strain put on the pension protection fund, because if that strain were unreasonable, then it wouldn't be there to protect savers where it is needed.
Does that answer your question, Con?
No, it doesn't. But we can come back. The point is that the funding ratio is applied across all schemes, regardless of whether or not it's USS. That was just an illustration. I could have used an illustration of a scheme which has less than 5.
And that's why it's a scheme-specific funding ratio, Con.
But it's still a ratio of assets to liabilities. And that introduces more false positives, or rather false negatives, than we should be considering. I'll send you a recent paper that explains the position. Good.
I'm pleased we can close that little discussion off in that positive way. Chris
It's
Evans,
hugely important, Henry.
I am not demeaning what you say at all, Con. I'm simply saying that we've got other questions, so we need to move on to them. And Chris, you had an interesting question about consolidation. Do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to refer people to the chat? Chris.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. It's sorry, clicking through is taking a bit of time to show up. It's really just a question around DC scheme consolidation and thinking about, does the TPR have a view of what a sort of ideal minimum size of a scheme might be, or ultimately how many providers you might want, in the marketplace in the long term, just to make sure that there is enough, member choice.
£50 billion being mentioned as a target. Yeah,
I'm not going to, obviously you would expect me to say this, I'm not going to put a figure on it. I mean, I get, I speak to a number of people in different forums. I was speaking as an accountant, I was speaking to some accountants not so long ago who were saying to me, pension schemes audits are getting very expensive. It's a really specialist skill, and it's very difficult for smaller schemes to get good value or audits that they can afford because they're quite small. Please, can they not have to do an audit? To which my response is no, they'll have to do an audit. And if a scheme is too small to be able to afford the expertise that is required to undertake an audit, then I think that's an indication in itself that that's where consolidation might need to be considered. So I'm not going to put a figure on it, but there becomes a level whereby these really basic elements of governance become quite expensive, and that's kind of not acceptable. I think it's really interesting your wording around master trust providers that provide a good level of choice to savers, because let's remember that savers don't choose their master trusts, employers do. And I've been quite interested by the industry's negative reaction to suggestions that at some point in the future, the suggestion from the Chancellor that we might consider a sort of pop for life model for savers rather than the current system where their employer chooses the master trust or the savings product that they are auto-enrolled or enrolled into. So the competition element is very important to us. I think it's healthy. It's supported by the government. The regulators have the sort of good regulation states that you should have an eye to competition in the market and seek to enable that. And I think that's healthy for those who are making choices, which are at the moment employers, helped by advisors. That's why the value for money piece of work is so important for us, to make sure that competition in that area is on the right. Is around the right things, around delivering good outcomes for savers, not just around cost. But certainly, we see that competition, innovation in that market around the right areas is important.
Very
I'm
good.
not going to put a number on it.
If I could just,
Chris,
Henry, just to mention something Sarah said, which was interesting. I mean, the concept of the plot for life. I spent sort of a few years working down in Australia, and that concept seemed to me to work really, really well. And obviously you've had a decent degree of consolidation now in the Aussie supermarket, but you've still got, with My Super, something like 70 funds that people can choose from, and you get a range. You've got a big range of providers who have different points of interest, lots of differentiation. You've got huge differences in sizes with funds like Aussie Super in total up at sort of 150 odd billion, but it's not always the big funds that are performing the best. So
yeah,
I think it's just trying to make sure that you don't end up with so much consolidation that you actually lose innovation and you lose the opportunity for funds that can be more differentiated, maybe more nimble.
Exactly. It comes back to that innovation point. For us, it's important that the barriers to entry shouldn't be so high that you don't get that it's impossible for new entrants to even consider coming into the market, because that's when you get real staleness and providers potentially lose sight of offering best value for savers because they don't have that competitive element, because the drawbridge has been pulled up.
We have a quiet graveyard, indeed. Any further questions? Because I've got a couple if you haven't, but I think it's now time for you guys to either put up your hands or make a comment. Shay. I'm really having trouble, Shay. Do I say Shay or Shay Sherry? tell me.
The one is fine, Henry. Thanks. It's not really a question. I just don't know if Connor's seen my comments in the box. So I've done quite a lot of research on the point he's raised, and I'm actually in agreement with him. But I would really appreciate it if he could send me the paper, because I'd really like to read it, if that's okay.
I think there's lots of people who've asked for the paper in the chat, so I think you're going to have to be sending it to everybody, Con.
Con, you may well want to contact me, and I might put it on the blog as well. That'd be good. Thank you very much, Maggie.
So let me just say, the paper I was thinking of sending you is actually the paper which is a paper which has been prepared by Jackie Grant of the Joint Negotiating Committee of USS. Technically, it is not mine to share because I agreed I would not share it without her permission. I will ask her for that. Okay.
I know that Derek's I can see Derek on the call as well, a keen proponent of the sort of cash flow based approach, paying liabilities for scheme management as well. So I'm sure he'd be interested in it.
Sorry, did you say Derek or Dennis?
Derek Scott.
Okay. Dennis Leach also has a paper which has been published literally on Friday, which covers uncertainty and cash flow type approaches, and that's a different kettle of fish, different subjects.
Look forward to hearing and circulating such documents, and the blog is at your disposal, everyone. Maggie.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Sarah. I was just thinking, we were a little bit disappointed after the consultation recently that there wasn't more in it about support for trustees. I'm completely with you about wanting everybody to be upping their game, but there's a lot of trustees that find it very difficult to get support for training or time off for training. And, you know, an employer seems to think that money spent on an advisor is well spent, but not on their trustees. So it would be really valuable to have more encouragement in the way you write about stuff like that, just to make sure we know what a good sponsor looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Leah, let's take a note of that. I mean, I know that when I talk about diversity in the trustee model, I know that actually it's not, you know, it's not necessarily the fact that trustee groups aren't good at recruiting diversely. It's actually that people don't want to apply because they don't get any time off from their employer, which is a legal responsibility for the employer to give that, that there isn't much support provided around training. I also, you know, that issue also expands to now lots of people are deferred members. You know, potentially they want to be a trustee of a scheme that they are deferred member of. They might not be allowed to be. I'm not allowed to be a trustee of a scheme that I'm a deferred member of. And actually then it becomes even more difficult, the consideration around time off, because should your current employer allow you time off to be a trustee of another scheme? So I think these are all really relevant considerations around trustee capability, the pipeline, diversity, etc. So let me take that away and think about how we work that in and engage with employers on that. Thank you, Maggie.
Somebody's got their hand up. Aaron, you've got your hand up. Do you want to quickly ask your question?
Maybe not.
Maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. I will move on quickly. There's a couple of very important questions come in. Bob's asked about the register. You did mention it earlier. Question really is when we can expect to see it. Do you have any idea about timeframes?
I don't have a specific idea about timeframes, but let me try and defer you a little bit to when we publish our corporate plan in a few months' time, and there will be more on the trustee register within that. Okay,
so it will be after the publication of the corporate plan, and that won't be for a couple of months. So no time soon, but possibly back end of the year.
I mean, it's not insignificant, the amount of work that we have to do to get a trustee register. It sounds straightforward, but it's not insignificant, and we want to do it right. So so we're not going to commit to doing it in 2 weeks' time, but it is a real focus for us this year.
Okay, I know Bob's left, so I asked the question on his behalf. But I think, Peter, you are still here. And you have, as always, an incisive question. Should the interest of members over their lifetime not be reflected in any decision about the future of the scheme? And does the regulatory framework not ensure such factors are taken into account? Do you want to expand, Peter, or is that a fair summary of your question?
Yes, it was specifically in relation to discretionary benefits where they're specified in the scheme rules.
Yes.
Yeah, obviously a hot topic at the moment. I'm not going to comment specifically on that other than say that, you know, discretionary benefits within the scheme rules are a matter for discussion between the trustees and the employer.
I'd love to know more about this, because there are expectations, aren't there? And certain schemes have given those expectations. At what point do those expectations harden into something more like a promise? But that's,
yeah, and isn't that interesting background for our considerations around CDC?
Thank you. Very interesting. Maggie, you got your hand up again. Do you want to come in?
You're on mute, Maggie.
Sorry, took this off. Where are we up to on sole trustees? Because that question just reminded me, because there's a lot of stuff about sole trustees being used by an employer to get the buyout done quickly, and how easy it is at that point to sort of forget about members' interests and just go for quick and cheap. And should there be more protection for members in the process of appointing sole trustees, both who it is and the fact that members lose all say in the process at that point, but don't get consulted about the changeover?
Thanks for that.
Thank you, Maggie. I was alluding to this in my response to the first question about this year's priorities and around trusteeship. The development of the professional trusteeship and the use of sole trustees is an area we've got a key focus on this year. The opportunities that are presented by that for consolidation, etc. I mean, is it anyway for that, but also the risks that are presented through that model as well. So that is a key area of focus for us this year.
Okay, thanks. And Steve Goddard also asked a question about corporate trustees, and he points out that there's quite a lot of discussion around using the PPF as consolidator. Have you got any update for us on government thinking about that, Sarah? I know you don't speak for government, no.
I'm sure the new chief executive of the PPF will be delighted to receive an invitation to come and speak to you about it.
Well, I think so. Right? It'll be very exciting developments that we have. And it's very nice to see so many of our senior people in our world have this year have been of the female gender. A bloody upside better thing than we had a few years back when the male hegemony was boring beyond belief. And I think on that happy note, I'm going to have to actually start winding today's proceedings up. I can't imagine 5-10 years ago we got the chair of the sort of the pension regulator coming along to an event like this, let alone answering all questions with such frankness and candor. And I think we really do want to say thank you very much indeed to Sarah Smart for giving us her time and her engagement this morning. So
well, and I just want to say thank you all, because you know, I'm very conscious that most of the people I speak to in the industry are doing it for all of the right reasons, and we're all working for the same ends. And I really value hearing your thoughts and input and getting your challenging questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know if you've got anything to say at the end, Steve, other than saying,
no, just to say a huge thanks to Sarah. Con, if you could come back to me or Henry with that permission, maybe we can issue it on your behalf, Con. And really appreciate everybody's questions and input, and a fantastic session. The video will be on the website later this afternoon. So if anybody needs to recap or have a look at that, then please do. Next week, we've got Margaret Snowdon. Some of you may have seen her on the BBC Breakfast sofa, talking about pension scamming and the treatment of tax from HMRC. So Margaret Snowdon, OBE, will be talking next Tuesday, so hopefully you can join us. And as usual, we pray for peace in the East and peace in the Middle East now. So thanks everybody for your attendance, and thanks again to Sarah. Hope you enjoyed the session, and yeah, hopefully you can join us next week. So
See you next week.
yep, take care everybody. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Really great,
Thank you.
great session. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.